Alrighty, y'all. So today I'm going to do a very quick review of Stranger Things season three. Right now I'm just kind of rewatching all the seasons of Stranger Things and giving you my off the top thoughts like usual. Now there's not really too much of a background before I go into my thoughts on this season, just because unlike the last two seasons, where I already watched those when those came out, I kind of stopped watching the show after season two. So this is all gonna be brand new stuff. I haven't seen really anything after season two, so this is all kind of my initial thoughts and reactions to it. I was kind of excited for season three, and I think for the most part, this season is really good. Now, I've heard some criticism online, like this might be the weakest season. I can't tell you that since I haven't seen the show in full context. But that being said, I think for the most part, there's a lot of really good things about this season. There's a lot of huge pros, and there's also some pretty big cons with this season. And there's definitely a shift, I guess, with this season into more of a. I can't really explain like the feeling. It feels more like it's a shift towards a more exaggerated, cartoonish version of itself, the show at least. And in a lot of weird ways, it feels like the most 80s of the seasons. And like I said, that's kind of weird since all of the seasons have taken place in the 80s. But this one feels even more so. It's got like all these kind of really crazy moments. It's got, of course, possession and other things like that, like usual. And there's in general just it feels more like an 80s product, of course, made in the 2019. But, I think that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it comes with the pros and cons. So I'm going to give you my pros, and then I'll get into my cons. For the pros, acting is great all around. Seeing the kids grow up in their roles is really cool. I do think it's a little bit drastic in some parts because it's just like it's a little bit of a jump. Like you go from season 2 into 3, and it's like Mike looks significantly older. The kids are all looking a bit older. It's pretty significant. And sometimes it's a little bit of a jarring watch, but it's natural. Like I said, you're filming a show with kids as they're growing up. But it can be pretty drastic. But all the kids, the actors do a great job. Visually, the film this season is stunning still, like always. I think the visual effects get more impressive as the series goes along. And in general, I would say this is maybe the goriest of all the seasons I've seen so far on Stranger Things. They go crazy with the blood, the gore, all the horror elements of this season were really good. Now, I will say that the horror elements are more about gore, monsters, and creepy things. Unlike the last two seasons felt more like psychological horror, right? There was a lot of possession. There was more creatures in the last season, but there's even more so in this one. And it feels like the filmmakers or the TV show runners wanted to kind of outdo themselves in this department. In some aspects, they absolutely did. The big new thing with this season is that the Mind Flayer's back, but it was kind of a follow-up from the last season. He's taken the form of some other people, and he's been collecting bodies to, I guess, kind of like building a monster, using the bodies as livestock, and creating a vessel for himself, which I think the monster is called just the Spider Monster, but it formulates this giant, ugly, disgusting, just gory monster. Initially it starts out with just like a kind of a puddle, but as more and more livestock or humans that get taken over and possessed, turned into this monster. And it's really cool. It's a huge highlight of the season. I actually kind of, in my last review for season 2, I mentioned that like it would be so cool if like maybe the Mind Flayer could have like a physical form, and it could be like a kaiju. Now, sadly, the creature doesn't reach kaiju level heights. He reaches about like maybe a tiny kaiju, but it's awesome nonetheless. I loved all the things with the spider monster. I love that aspect of the show. It's probably the element of the series for me personally I really enjoyed the most. I thought that was really great. And like I said, I have a little bit of a bias here. I love Godzilla movies. I love giant monsters and a lot of stuff. And this is no different. This has to be probably my favorite creature so far in Stranger Things. I loved all that stuff. In general, too, I think the general mystery of it is pretty good. like usual. But I do think it gets a little bit scattered because multiple parties are doing different things throughout the season. They all kind of link up to figure out the same situation. But when I get to some of my cons, it doesn't feel as well crafted as season 2 or 1. Um, but that being said, I loved all the horror and gore elements. That was really cool stuff. Also, the whole idea of the Russians being in this. Now, I did think it was a little bit absurd that the Russians are involved. But then again, this is a show taking place during the 80s. Like I said, previously, this feels like the most 80s of this 80s show. Because, of course, you can have the commies in there and that Cold War element. And, I liked it for what it was. I thought it was enjoyable. Like I said, a secret lab below the mall is kind of crazy, but it's cool. It's outlandish. I didn't mind that element. All the characters too naturally progress, and some of them work. Like I think Mike and Eleven's relationship, really expands here a lot more than the previous season, which it seems like we just kind of missed a portion of their relationship, but we get the gist of it. They're madly in love. Initially in the season, they go through a cycle of boundaries with Hopper, and then, Eleven meets Max, another girl friend, and then it just kind of turns into a whole thing like that. But there's definitely a connection still between them, and I enjoyed that part about it. I just kind of wish we got to see the blossoming of that kind of relationship. We just didn't get to see that because there was a time gap between this season and this last season. So yeah, but still pretty cool stuff. All the other characters, Max and Lucas in a relationship, that's still a thing. Also, the whole argument between Will and then Lucas and the other boys, they're all talking about girls. There's this whole dilemma of we can't keep playing Dungeons and Dragons and all this other kids stuff when we have girlfriends, and just characters are growing up in general. Just how all the characters dealing with that. And I thought that was all pretty good stuff, even though I do feel like it was pretty heavy-handed, and I can't remember how old these kids are, but it's like some of these topics, I'm like, y'all should be a little, I don't know, y'all are like a little old to be talking about things like that, but like I said, maybe they're high school, sure, but, y'all just still technically kids. I mean, just beginning to be teenagers, but, like I said, it's all pretty good stuff. It's natural for the story as the characters grow up. I just do think it was a little bit heavy-handed sometimes. Billy is also a lot more of a focus, I guess, somewhat. We get to learn a lot more about him, which he was a standout in the last season. I liked him a lot more in this season, too. I thought that they really made a really cool character of Billy here. And throughout the whole season, he's been possessed by the Mind Flayer. He's doing a lot of things against his will. But then we learn more that we learn more about his past through, like, the Mind Flayer being possessed. 11 kind of explores some of his past, especially with his mother, like a very good memory of her and him on the beach back when he was more happy, and just kind of a reminder of, like, how happy he used to be and maybe how happy he could be, and breaks out of the snap at the end with the Mind Flayer. And it was really cool stuff, and I really enjoyed all the Billy character stuff. I do think they could have gone into it a bit more in depth, but then again, he was mind controlled for most of the season, so I guess it makes sense. Dustin and Steve are really cool. Steve's pretty great. I do feel like he has a little bit less to do in this season, but I like the fact that Dustin and Steve are hanging out more. There's a subplot between him. There's another new character that gets introduced with Steve. What was her name? Robin. She was pretty cool. I mean, she was enjoyable, I guess. And Lucas's sister is also in this, surprisingly. And there's just a lot more additional characters, and they all, like I said, for the most part, work. I also forgot to mention Nancy and Jonathan. They're a full-on thing in this season. That's pretty cool stuff. I think it's really cool how they trying to prove themselves as reporters, and then the whole thing with Hopper possibly dying. Like I said, I think I heard he was coming back, but I can't remember. That was a really cool and interesting element. Very good hook at the end of the season. And like I said, there's a lot of really good and interesting story elements. Really good stuff. And definitely, like I said, I think overall this is a good season. But now let's get into some of my cons, because I do feel like this season, one big issue with it is it feels like it's a bit overstuffed and overloaded. It doesn't feel as tight and concise as the first season. The first season was great. It was a really good and interesting unfolding mystery. Season 2 was really good, but they introduced more elements. Season 3 feels like they're trying to kind of juggle all of these elements while at the same time characters are growing up, and sometimes it becomes a bit too much. Like I said, I do like the more gory, cartoony 80s vibe to this season for the most part. I do think the Russians, the whole plot about them building something underneath a mall, like I said, it is the 80s. It's fine. But I do think that part of it was like, okay, guys, this is a little bit absurd. And I'm sure maybe they'll explain more of it as it goes along, because, like I said, I'm very fascinated how the hell they found out about all this stuff. But that being said, I do think some of those elements make it feel a little bit outlandish, and having multiple characters with other people doing different things, and then all kind of tying up at the end, it gets a little bit too much. And sometimes, characters that could have had more exploration don't have as much. Like, I think Will doesn't really do much in this entire season, surprisingly. I was kind of expecting a bit more out of him. But, I think that there's just a bit too much going on. I think a more tighter, concise story, more character stuff, and also just in general, some of the dialogue needs to be a little bit better written. I think, just don't be so obvious with the character changes and dialogue. And I think the season could have been a lot better. I still don't think it's bad or anything. I don't think it's a huge downgrade. I just think that compared to the first season, it's a downgrade, but it's like you can fix the ship, right? It's not like a massive downgrade as some of the other TV shows, over the years I've had. It's just a slight downgrade in quality. I think it's getting a bit outlandish. There's a bit too much going on. There's a bit too many parties involved. And just in general, just more stronger characterization, a more tight focus on the story, and also maybe just kind of move away and try something new, which they do sometimes here. The whole possession thing doesn't get a bit tiresome at the end. I do think that, though, this season definitely changes things, especially with Hopper possibly being dead, some of the characters moving away. It's going to be very fascinating how Season 4 is going to wind up, but I enjoyed Season 3. It's pretty good. It's a solid continuation, but a tighter focus on story, narratives, and plot lines was needed. But I do enjoy more of the outlandish elements. Like I said, I loved all the gore, and especially the spider monster. In my personal opinion, so far, the best creature in the series. Really enjoyed him. Really enjoyed all the action sequences. The CGI, of course, top tier. The performances, top tier. So yeah, like I said, overall, still a really good season. I don't think there's really ever been a bad season of Stranger Things. But like I said, I do think this one needs a slight improvement. But yeah, my quick thoughts on Season 3. Hopefully you all have a good day. Peace, y'all.